Once upon a time in the hills of West Virginia, there lived a cute, furry little youngster. One day, the youngster stumbled into a scrapyard in Charleston that became a playground of sorts for the little guy. Now, this particular scrapyard happened to be owned by a man known as Poor Charlie. One day, Poor Charlie caught the little guy hiding behind a broken-down truck. Though Charlie was startled, he quickly smiled and asked, "What's your name, son?" Shy and confused, the young furry simply shrugged his shoulders. "You don't have a name?" replied Poor Charlie. The furry just shook his head. "Well then," Poor Charlie said, "my name is Charlie, so how about we call you Chuck?" Chuck agreed with a smile. Chuck was a very active young creature, but since he wasn't like the rest of the boys and girls in town, he kept to himself in the scrapyard with only Poor Charlie as a friend. Poor Charlie's son, Bob Levine, owned a local baseball team called the Charleston Charlies. So one day, Charlie took Chuck to a game. Chuck fell in love with it immediately. He loved everything, from the smell of the hot dogs, to the roar of the crowds, to the crack of the bats. Though he visited the park occasionally, he mostly watched from the train tracks or the wooded hills overlooking the ballpark. The distance allowed him to enjoy the game and escape the stares and teasing he would take from other kids for being so different. For the next few years, Chuck spent every possible moment watching the Charlies play and fueling his passion for the game. Chuck was happier than he had ever been. But one day, the happiness ended. Chuck went to visit Charlie at the scrapyard and overheard the worst news ever. The Charleston Charlies had been sold and the team would be leaving town. Devastated and not knowing where to turn, Chuck headed back into the hills of West Virginia. For the next several years, he wandered aimlessly through the country searching for a new team that ignited that same passion he had once felt for the Charlies. After years of unsuccessful searching, Chuck gave up on his passion for baseball and returned to his home in the hills of West Virginia to begin a new chapter in his life. Upon returning, he heard mention of a new baseball team that was drawing crowds and creating excitement like never before. Although he had given up, his heart leapt at the possibility of finally finding a team to call his own. Chuck raced down through the woods towards that old familiar field, Wat Powell Park. And as he reached the train tracks where he had watched the games as a youngster, he couldn't believe his eyes. The field was gone. Sad and confused, Chuck shuffled along the train tracks, sulking about his discovery. After a few minutes, he stumbled across an old bowler hat and a half-smoked cigar, which reminded him of Poor Charlie. He put out the cigar, then bent down, scooped up the hat, and gently placed it on his head. Suddenly, a breeze swept through the valley, and a crumpled piece of paper tumbled towards Chuck's feet. He picked up the paper and opened it up. It was a Help Wanted ad. As Chuck read down the paper, his heart leapt once again. It was a Help Wanted ad from the West Virginia Power, the town's new baseball team, and they were looking for a new mascot. Finally, thought Chuck, this is my chance to be a part of a team. Upon further inspection of the ad, he saw that the team had moved to a new stadium across the river, and Chuck didn't waste a moment. He took off in a flash of yellow fur and headed for the new ballpark. Out of breath, Chuck arrives at Appalachian Power Park and shows the receptionist the Help Wanted ad. She immediately escorts him to the boss's office for an interview. In an instant, the boss knew Chuck had what it took to fill the position as the team's new mascot. The next day, Chuck receives his uniform, and that night, in front of a stadium full of thousands of fans, he made his debut as the newest member of the West Virginia Power.